Why could the feudal lord sell his handmaid? The grim reality of fiefdoms. In the centuries following the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe plunged into a social landscape dominated by land, military protection, and deep-rooted hierarchical relations. The feudal structure was consolidated as the foundation of medieval societies, shaping behaviors, beliefs, and boundaries between classes. Among nobles, knights, peasants, dependent laborers, and serfs, a rigid system developed that regulated rights, duties, and, above all, the control exercised over people and property. Within this world, an aspect that today causes astonishment and discomfort is the fact that many feudal lords had the prerogative to sell, exchange, or transfer serfs, including women, along with the land. To understand how and why this happened, it is necessary to delve deeply into the dark, legal, and cultural reality that shaped medieval society. The servile condition was not born out of nowhere. It was a direct result of the collapse of Roman structures, chronic insecurity, and the need for survival. With the retraction of cities and commerce, most populations sought refuge in large rural properties. Their peasants began to offer work in exchange for protection. At first, these relationships were more flexible, based on informal agreements, but over time, they became rigid and hereditary. Land has ceased to be a free space to cultivate and has become part of a closed set of obligations. The person who attached himself to a landlord by necessity or by indirect coercion was bound not only to agricultural work, but also to the personal domain of the feudal lord. This relationship of deep dependence was consolidated by customary laws, local traditions that had legal value, and by a Christianized imaginary that justified the social order as something natural, immutable, and willed by God. Within this structure, the serf was not considered enslaved, but neither was he free. He occupied an intermediate position, marked by severe limitations. He could not abandon a manor, move without authorization, sell his crops freely, or decide on his fate without permission from the lord. The link between serf and land was so strong that serfs came to be included as part of feudal property, like houses, animals, and crops. They were listed in inventories and records of possession. In a way, the feudal lord's right over his serfs was a direct extension of the right over land. It also meant that when a fief was sold, ceded, or inherited, its servantsmen, women, and children were automatically transferred along with it. This phenomenon raises a disturbing question. How could an entire society accept that servile women, often vulnerable, poor, and without alternatives, were treated as items of economic value? The answer lies in the combination of three pillars: the medieval legal structure, the social power of the landlord, and the religious vision of the time, which legitimized social hierarchies as part of a divine plan. Within this context, the servant woman carried an even greater vulnerability. In addition to being subject to the same obligations as men, she faced expectations related to motherhood, marriage, and control over her own body. Feudalism developed customs that made it difficult for people from different fiefdoms to marry, often requiring the payment of fees for authorization. A servant who married an outsider could be withheld or prevented, and, if released, generated losses for the master, who demanded financial compensation. This reinforced their status as an economic resource rather than as a fully autonomous individual. The practice of selling or transferring handmaidens was also related to the agricultural productivity of the fief. Servile families were seen as units of work. The greater the number of members, the greater the associated productive force. Therefore, The birth of new servants was considered an increase in patrimony. Women of childbearing age, therefore, were even more valued by the feudal lords. The prospect that their children would automatically become serfs reinforced the dehumanization embedded in the system. Motherhood, something sacred and natural, was transformed into an economic instrument that expanded the wealth and labor power of the landlord. Another factor that aggravated the situation was the absence of social mobility. While urban merchants, artisans, and burghers gradually found ways to rise in society, serfs, particularly those living in isolated rural areas, were rarely able to escape the hereditary cycle of serfdom. A son was born a servant, lived as a servant, and died as a servant. The master had the authority to control where he lived, how much he worked, and how his family organized itself. For women, this often meant the impossibility of choosing their partners, of avoiding forced unions, or of preventing the transfer of their homes if the fief was sold or reorganized. The Catholic Church, while playing a crucial role in combating extreme abuse, rarely questioned the overall structure of servitude. He defended human dignity but accepted the hierarchical social order as part of God's will. Often, priests and bishops advised masters to act with compassion, but they did not condemn the system that allowed the sale or transfer of servants. Some monasteries even had large numbers of serfs on their estates, justifying this as necessary to sustain religious activities. Paradoxically, institutions that preserved faith and culture also reinforced a system that profoundly limited the freedom and autonomy of millions of people. The condition of women, in particular, was aggravated because control over them also involved issues of morality, honor, and inheritance. The servant was seen as a fundamental link in the continuity of the servile lineage. Their relationships, their fertility, and their ability to work were monitored by the fief administrators. In many places, there were specific fees that had to be paid when a servant girl married, when she changed fiefs, or even when her children came of age. This made it evident that, for the landlord, the servant was not only a worker, but an essential part of the human capital on which he depended. The sale of handmaidens took place in specific contexts. These were not, in general, public markets, as in the case of ancient slavery. The transfer was indirect, linked to the land, when a fief was divided, donated, exchanged, or inherited. All serfs in that territory, including women, were automatically transferred. In some exceptional cases, serfs could be sold individually, especially when they represented loss, debt, or conflict between masters. Although rare, this practice existed and demonstrates how the servile person could be treated as an alienable good. The servant woman, therefore, lived under the constant weight of uncertainty. Her home, her family, and her future were in the hands of an authority who could rearrange her life without warning or consent. From the 12th century onwards, changes began to slowly transform this reality. The growth of the cities, the revival of trade, the strengthening of the bourgeoisie, and the emergence of a monetary economy weakened the foundations of feudalism. Many serfs began to buy their freedom. Others fled to urban centers where, according to German tradition, the air of the city makes free. This phrase symbolized the idea that after a certain period living in a city, a person could gain legal freedom. The Church also began to promote doctrines more in line with human dignity, gradually influencing social relations. However, these advances did not quickly erase centuries of entrenched feudal practices. Even in decline, the system maintained its rigidity in several regions of Europe until the 15th century, and in some areas until the 18th. The view that certain people belonged to the land rather than to themselves has become part of a dark heritage that recalls human complexity. The ability to create systems of protection and survival, but also to justify inequalities, abuses, and severe limitations on freedom. The medieval servant especially symbolizes this duality, an essential worker in the rural economy, but also vulnerable to a set of traditions that transformed her into a resource, currency, and tool of production. The question: why could the feudal lord sell his servant? Reveals more than a legal aspect, reveals a mindset. For a society founded on land ownership, control of the means of production, and the need for stability, people were no longer seen as individuals and became part of the machinery that sustained power. The servant, reduced to an element of economic value, represents the darkest side of fiefdoms. Dehumanization supported by customs, local laws, and the social structure itself. To understand this reality is to recognize that history is not only made of conquests, castles, and knights, but also of silences, suffering, and profound limitations imposed on the most vulnerable. It is to remember that human dignity, although spiritually defended, has not always been socially or legally recognized. The feudal world no longer exists, but its marks remain as a reminder that powerful systems can last for centuries, even when they violate fundamental principles of freedom and equality. Today, when looking at this past, it is understood that servitude and the possibility of selling handmaidens were not mere isolated practices, but symptoms of a broad social model which shaped mentalities and left an ambiguous legacy. Feudalism preserved Europe in times of chaos, but it also imprisoned millions within rigid structures. The medieval servant is a symbol of this paradox, at the same time the mainstay of rural life and the victim of a system that treated her as part of the land, not as an autonomous human being. Analyzing this reality is essential to understand not only history, but also the depth and complexity of the transformations that allowed the birth of the modern world.